So, as Philip said, I'm kind of the self-appointed ungulate expert on the ranch. I'm actually going to be focusing mostly on elk, but I have just a few slides about mule deer and white-tailed deer to sort of whet your palates, but elk are the main focus. So, to dive right in, this map shows basically just any location that I have seen white-tailed deer in the past 2 years, and that doesn't represent frequency or anything like that. It more shows a distribution of their use of the ranch. And you can see that they're much happier closer to lowland areas, and you'll see them a little bit in the upland areas. Typically they'll kind of travel in the draws, and just another reason that our draws are so important, because they're not just for birds, but travel for wildlife of all kinds. And of course, they spend quite a bit of time in our agricultural areas. So we have center pivots and the sandfoin bench down at the near the northwest side of the property. And here we have the high counts of group sizes throughout the 2 years of study so far. My studies tend to go from October through the end of March or April, so it's still ongoing. So I'm just showing data that I have to compare. And the way I did this was basically just take the highest number of, the highest group sizes per week and graph them on here. So you can see it's extremely variable. There's a little bit of an upswing towards the end of the study period, but not much that I can really see. Maybe you can see more if you sort of squint your eyes or something, but it's just sort of an idea to show there's quite a bit of variability in group size among whitetail. And I really like this photo. It's a deer crossing the McClay Bridge just north of the property, and I have so many photos of ungulates that I just figured I had to throw in as many as I could. So you're going to be getting a lot of gratuitous ungulate shots. Moving right along to mule deer, I've done the same thing, mapping the sort of distribution of observations. You can see it's a completely different area for the most part. There's a little bit of overlap in some of the center pivots and agricultural areas, but they tend to be more upland where Nate's bitterbrush are, and that is primarily what they're feeding on during this time of year. Group size shows a little bit more of that same upward trend in group sizes as the end of the study period approaches. But again, lots of variation, and with both of these groups, it's really, they tend to be so interspersed and not visible unless you stumble upon them in all of those draws that it's just really variable. So, but there's a general idea. And now we're going to move on to elk. My research has been sort of addressing several questions, but I'm going to speak with you mostly about three main research objectives. One is how nutrient and forage availabilities are changing throughout this fall and winter period. How much available forage and browse are elk consuming? And then last of all, where do our elk choose to spend their time on the ranch? And I've also done a little bit of tracking them when I can outside of the ranch, mainly on the Sapphire Ranch north. But you know, all of these questions are related to each other, and they're also related to a lot of the work that other people are doing on the ranch. So it's really neat to be able to sort of tie in a lot of research. So our study area is kind of consisting of 3 blocks, 150 points total. And mainly in these study areas, we were collecting biomass samples and doing elk pellet counts. And these are just areas of high elk use that were deemed to be the most likely to produce some kind of results. Now, there have been aerial surveys happening for many years, and Craig Jordanay has, for the past 3, We have some aerial surveys from Hunting District 204, which is where MPG is. And 2010, 11, and 12, you can see almost across the board an upward trend in cows, calves, and bulls, which is what everybody in the Bitterroot wants to hear. So that said, how does that translate to the ranch? Our highest counts have also seen the same sort of upswing. 2009 and 10, there were 252, 318, 426. This year, I've only seen 413 on the ranch in one discrete day, but there were 452 just north on Sapphire. So that trend is continuing, and there are elk all bunched up, scared of some scary ranch worker or something. So again, I have a group size per week here that just shows general trends and general extreme variation. But there do seem to be a lot of trends with just a slight increase towards the end of the winter and early spring that kind of suggests that they're changing their herding and grouping behaviors. And related to our group sizes are these two lovely bachelors who tend to spend most of their time in the fall and winter with other bachelors. And they're really hard to find because they're not in open areas like the rest of the herd. But they also have different foraging needs, and so they're off, risking their safety to get more nutrients because of all of the energy they expended during the rut. And maybe you men can relate to that, but just kidding. So here I just have a map or a graph of basic areas of the ranch and then the mean herd size over the past 2 years. And it just gives you an idea of basically where are our bachelors hanging out, which is clearly the boondocks and Baldy. The west side of the valley also tends to have the ones that I have seen, just smaller groups, usually around 60. And they're pretty traditionally hanging out in the same spot over there. And as Philip was saying earlier, we'd really like to do more research on how these elk are moving and what sort of movement we have outside of the ranch, because that's really what it's all about. Our elk are not here all the time, so we need to learn more about them. And then these herd sizes with larger group numbers are going to be mainly cows and calves and the young bulls and spikes. So you can see those tend to be in areas with pretty open, not really very shrubby, just sort of open and visible and secure areas. This is really difficult to see, actually, but I had made a couple maps earlier showing frequency of observations, but since you can't see them, I won't really delve into it too much. And because the study period is still ongoing, I haven't had a chance to do the entire study period, but there are some differences which you can't see. So, and here's a smaller group that is on Little Baldy just a few weeks ago, actually. So another way to sort of, aside from observations, tell where our elk are going is to use pellet clusters, which is scat piles from an individual elk. And we've used our 150 study points to this is our historic pellet cluster density. So the first year we did it, we counted all of the elk and deer pellets that we saw at each of these points. And so this gives you an idea of where historically elk have been hanging out. And I think it's a little, I think it's really related to proximity to open areas and security for the most part. So with this, after our initial study, or after our initial count, we were able to do 2 surveys, one in the spring and one in the fall. And in doing so, we can track changes in use over that particular season. And another map, courtesy of Debbie, is showing kind of the seasonal changes. So in spring, you have the least to the most amount of pellets versus the fall. And I think a lot of the fall can be attributed to kind of green up that happens and things like that. And spring is traditionally just what has accumulated over the winter. So sometimes they're a little harder to tell because of snow melt and things like that. And then in these same study points, we've taken biomass samples, and we do that as well in the spring and fall. And this kind of allows us to see changes in forage availability. And again, in the spring, you can see the pivots are really kind of getting amped up, and oftentimes the spring green up will bring a lot of extra biomass. But biomass is especially high in areas like crested wheatgrass and intermediate, and those aren't especially palatable, but they have a lot of biomass. So it's an interesting thing to think about when you're kind of thinking about what elk can eat and what is available for them to eat. And here's just, if you can kind of see, they're overlaid with the pellet density changes, and there's some trends that pop out, but it's not anything that is extremely comparable. So along with just counting the pellets, I've also had the opportunity to take a few samples of them and send them to get analysis. One of the metrics that we used was the percent nitrogen, which is often correlated with dietary energy and digestibility. And so there's a general sort of trend, and it's a small sample size, so that has to be considered as well. But general trend of a slight uptake, probably right around the time that the center pivots are at their peak and then dying off. And then elk are actually consuming more forage, but less nutritious forage. So that's kind of an interesting graph, and hopefully we can be doing more of those to get a better idea of if this is really happening on a large scale, and if there are differences between cows in the larger herd and our bachelors. And that's one of my favorite photos of SCAT, because it got impaled by a little grass. Naturally, I didn't do that. Here's a few of the valuable forage grasses and forbs. These are all present on the ranch, and it's taken from a large study by Kufeld back in '73. But these kinds of things, the nutritious values of a plant don't change. So it's really interesting to see how many forbs are concentrated in summer and fall, as you might guess. So what really happens is the shift toward grasses and often less nutritious plants during the fall and winter. And it's also interesting to think about how these plants are distributed across the ranch and how that could affect where elk move, or how elk affect how these things grow. So, and here we have some more elk just south of Whaley Draw. So of these SCAT samples that were taken, this is the analysis, one of the analyses that came back, and it's a little bit overwhelming, but again, it tracks changes over time, and it tracks individual diet variability. And so agropyron species, which include blue bunch and also crested and intermediate, are represented on this top row, and they're a pretty big fraction. But you can also see wheat and corn play a really large role and then taper off significantly. And when they taper off, then we start to see other plants like fescues start taking their place. So, and if anyone has any idea of a red-orange seed, that was quite a large component in one specific diet. So anyway, and forbs down the bottom are pretty minimal. And I've broken that down just visually for you to see. If we take out the forbs, which is the little purple, it's mostly grasses. And you can see, again, those agropyron species and fescues are really the main components. And now if we reverse that and we take just the forbs, they're not really making up a large portion. Balsam root is probably the biggest of the forbs. And here is basically another graph showing the decrease in grasses, or the decrease in forb use and increase in grasses over this time period. And that's all.